So we will get a 1249p here.
See if we can arrange that in a good fashion.
Natural philosophy tries to distinguish what scientists have discovered about nature from their interpretation of these discoveries. The interpretation is regularly influenced by metaphysical preconceptions. Especially supra-empirical ontologies. Views of the kinds of things that there are in the domain addressed by the science. Such views form an unavoidable part of scientific theorizing. The more ambitious the theory, the larger their role is likely to be. The cost for relying on them is an unacknowledged blindness. The progress of science requires that they be occasionally identified, resisted, overturned, and replaced. Natural philosophy can be useful in the early stages of such an effort. It cannot accomplish or even justify a reorientation of the agenda of any science, relying solely on its own limited resources. Yet from the outset, and unlike much of the now established philosophy of science, its intentions may be revisionists, not merely analytic or interpretive. On what basis and by what method it can hope to do this revisionist work is what I seek to elucidate in this section. The argument of this book disputes widespread accounts of what cosmology and physics have discovered about the universe, including accounts that continue to exert influence within these sciences, not simply in philosophical or popularizing discourse about them. It contradicts, for example, leading interpretations of general relativity as well as cosmological conceptions such as the notion of a multiverse that have commanded a wide following. A third trait of natural philosophy, as we exemplify it here, represents a break with much of the way in which natural philosophers used to view their own work, when natural philosophy was an accepted genre. We deal with problems that are both basic and general. We do so, however, without depending on metaphysical ideas. Outside or above science. We do not think of the natural philosophy that would now be most useful, or indeed of philosophy in general, as a super science in which untrammeled speculation can take the place of the dialectic of empirical inquiry and theoretical analysis that moves science forward. Our watchword is to take on a foundational matters on terms that dispense with foundational doctrines. A fourth characteristic of natural philosophy, as we here interpret and try to recover it, is that as it intervenes in discussion of the agenda of natural science, it attenuates the clarity of the divide between a discourse within science and a discourse about science. It cannot claim the authority of a scientific inquiry. You will find here no hypotheses closely embedded in a context of empirical testing or falsification, and equipped with any of the mathematical and technological tools. With which natural science has armed itself. Nevertheless, the issues that we address and the ideas that we present do not simply take the present direction of physics and cosmology for granted. They have implications for our beliefs about what should happen next in cosmology and physics. They even provide a perspective outside science from which to assess the path that contemporary science in these fields has taken. They have revisionists' potential as well as revisionists' intentions. How can ideas manifestly lacking in any of the mathematical or technological instruments of science nevertheless claim to speak to the direction of science like cosmology? The answer lies in an understanding of the proper relation between a first-order discourse and higher order or meta-discourse. It lies as well in the practice of three methods that make use of such an understanding in the advancements of its revisionist program. A first-order discourse is a discourse within a particular science or discipline. It begins from where the science or discipline finds itself at a given moment, even at a particular place. Its accepted methods of analysis, explanation, argument, and proof. And its guiding assumptions about nature and about thought. For natural science, some of the most important presuppositions are those that have to do with laws and symmetries and their relation to structure and change in nature. Others deal with mathematics as well, with the relation of the mathematical analysis to causal explanation. Even for a first order discourse, however, the ruling ideas, the dominant theories, and the accepted methods need not to be the point of arrival, although they are sure to be the point of departure. They can be revised piece by piece under the pressure of discovery and imagination. A higher order discourse addresses such presuppositions directly and passes judgment on them in the name of considerations that may include those that would be acknowledged to carry weight within the particular science or discipline, but are not limited to such considerations. A defining move in a higher order discourse may be to suggest a change in some of these presuppositions. Such a change may be motivated by the hope that it will throw surprising and revealing light on well-established facts and suggest a shift of direction a new way of looking at the familiar. Offering a path into the unfamiliar. To serve as a terrain for the development of such proposals has historically been the province of philosophy. A common tendency in contemporary philosophy is to depreciate such higher order discourse as an exorbitant attempt to claim for speculative reason an authority that belongs only to the specialized forms of inquiry, and in particular to the distinct sciences. The only meta-discourse we need, according to this view, is a meta-discourse that discredits the pretensions of all meta-discourses. Natural philosophy has no place in such a view. One of the most important justifications of natural philosophy is the relativity of the distinction between a first-order discourse and a meta-discourse. The more far-reaching a new conception at the first-order level is, the more likely it is to imply and to require a change in established presuppositions about method or content in science. Conversely, any proposal in a higher order discourse to revise substantive or methodological assumptions will and should be assessed by its effect on the insights to be gained down below. Its consequences for the work of particular disciplines. It is sheer dogmatism to stipulate from where forward movement will come. Normally it will come from the internal conflicts of first order discourses. As such controversies escalate, they soon begin to cross the frontiers that separate them from the higher order conversation. Occasionally, however, breakthroughs of insight will begin in this second order conversation. And then gain interests as their implications for the first order discussion become clear. One criterion of intellectual ferment and of the advance in insight that such ferment may encourage is the frequency and the intensity with which this double movement from higher order to first order discourse and back again takes place. A byproduct of such double movement is the attenuate, rigid divisions among sciences. Debates transcending the distinction between higher order and first order discourse are likely to engage more than one field and to bring into question the orthodoxies of method and vision around which each such field is organized. Along the difference between higher order and first order discourse, the divisions among disciplines wedded to methods, a third distinction will be weakened by this intellectual turn. The contrast between normal and revolutionary science. We can best understand the significance of this third subversion by a political and historical comparison. After all, the contrast between revolutionary and normal science is itself the product of just such an analogy. The dominant traditions of classical social theory Marxism included, distinguish between the revolutionary substitution of one system for another, and the management of a system and its contradictions. They imagined each such framework to be an indivisible whole, all the parts of which stand or fall together. Consequently, they divided politics into reformist tinkering and revolutionary transformance, associating gradualism with the former and sudden, a violent change with the latter. These categorical contrasts are misguided. There are no indivisible and historically recurrent institutional systems such as capitalism, each with its built-in logic of reproduction and transformation. Change can be fragmentary and gradualist in its method, and nevertheless radical in its outcome, if it continues in a certain direction, especially if it is informed by an idea. Revolutionary reform represents the characteristic form of structural change. Wholesale revolution supplies only the limiting case. However, the relation between the reproduction of a certain institutional order and its transformation is far from being a constant in history. It is a variable. We can indeed distinguish between the normal moves we make within a framework of institutions and conceptions that we take for granted, and the exceptional moves by which we change pieces of such a framework. Once again, the distance and the distinction between these two sets of activities vary. Our institutional arrangements and discursive practice can be arranged to either increase or diminish the distinction and the distance. an institutional and ideological ordering of social life can have, in superior degree, the attribute of laying itself open to criticism and revision. As a result, it can allow the transformation of society and culture to arise more constantly out of the daily activities by which, as individuals and as groups, we pursue our interests and ideals within the established context. Our most powerful material and moral interests are engaged in the enhancement of this attribute of social and cultural regimes. Such an enhancement is causally connected to the conditions for the development of our productive capabilities through economic growth and organizational innovation. It is also causally related to the conditions for the disentanglement of our practical, emotional, and cognitive dealings with one another from entrenched social divisions and hierarchy. Practical progress requires freedom to experiment and to recombine not just things, but also people, practices, and ideas. Moral emancipation demands that we be able to relate to another as the context and role transcending individual that we now all hope to be, rather than as placeholders in some grinding scheme of hierarchical order and pre-established division in society. Neither of these two sets of requirements is likely to be satisfied unless we succeed in building societies and cultures that facilitate their own reconstruction, weakening the power of the past to define the future and diminish the extent to which crisis must serve as midwife to change. In addition to the service that it renders to these fundamental material and moral interests, this property of self-revision has independent value. It attenuates the contrast between being within an institutionalized and discursive context and being outside it. We can never establish the definitive context of life or of belief, the one that would accommodate everything that we have reason to prize. The next best thing to finding the definitive, all-inclusive context is to develop arrangements and assumptions that, in satisfying our fundamental material and moral interests, also best lend themselves to correction in the light of experience. Corrigibility supersedes finality. We can engage in such an order even single-mindedly and wholeheartedly without surrendering to it. In the midst of our ordinary business, we can keep the last word to ourselves rather than giving it to the regime. In this way, the social world that we inhabit becomes less of a place of exile and torment. It no longer separates us from ourselves by exacting surrender as the place of engagement and isolation as the price of transcendence. An institutional and ideological framework of social life that is endowed with this power to facilitate its own remaking enjoys an evolutionary advantage over the rivals. However, we do not select from a closed list of ways of organizing society and culture and institutional system ready-made to seize this advantage. We choose from the messy materials of a relatively accidental history and turn them into something else. Every word in these remarks about culture and society applies. By analogy and with adjustment to the structure of our scientific beliefs and practices. The nature and the extent of the contrast between normal science and scientific revolution are at stake in the history of science. A stronger, deeper science would be one exhibiting in its normal practice some of the characteristics that we ascribe to its revolutionary interludes. One of these characteristics is a more ample dialectic among theories, instruments, observations, and experiments than is ordinarily practiced. Another is the investigation of problems that require crossing boundaries among fields as well as among the methods around which each field is organized. Yet another is the deliberate and explicit mixing of higher order and first order discourse. Viewed in this light, natural philosophy works to overcome the contrast between normal and revolutionary science. We aim simultaneously to recover and to reorient the 18th century genre of natural philosophy. No idle speculation, but engagement in the agenda of science and in our ideas about the relation of science to the rest of our worldview should be the ambition of a reconstructed natural philosophy. It must be, as I argue below, an engagement defined by concerns, limitations, and methods distinguishing natural philosophy from science. Today, natural philosophy has not disappeared completely. It lives under disguise. Scientists write popular books for the general educated public, professing to make their ideas about science that they practice accessible to non-scientists. They use these books to speculate about the larger meaning of the discoveries for our understanding of the universe and our place within it. They also have another audience. However, their colleagues in science, addressed under the disguise of popularization. The popularizing books have become a secret form of the vanished genre, a crypto-natural philosophy. Here we propose to cast the shield down and to do natural philosophy in just the sense we have specified, without disguise or apology. We reinterpret the meaning of some of what physics and cosmology have discovered about the world and argue for a revision of some attitudes, assumptions, and expectations with which we do science. Absolutely marvelous. I think I'll end there. That's a good point in ending. It's very eloquent and clear ending here. Slowly he goes through what is amiss, and it's an error of thinking that is so ingrained. So how do you even discover it? But it's true. Through the natural philosophies, we get a very exquisite insight, a way into understanding what it is about and how science has been abandoned, deserted, and generalized in this really weird fashion. And I'm so happy that this comes to me as an additive to the insights I already had before from Paul Feyerabend and, of course, very important, constructive mathematics, Brouwer and Bishop, without understanding that mathematics is maybe the most easy victim to these generalizations or the two fallacies that you can understand. But for me to generalize this or take it out to see it also pertaining to physics, cosmology, that was far from easy. When we confound mathematics with physics, then the problem starts. And that confoundation, that confusion was already present the day I was born. I grew up with it. So do have patience with my understanding, and for all sake, your own understanding. This is inherent in each and every one of us. And I now understand why the book has 550 pages. It takes time to painstakingly, accurately show wherein lies the error. Because in the same moment, as we say in Sweden, pointing with the whole hand, obfuscation start. You need to point with a narrow finger, the breadth of a nanometer, so to speak, or why not, Ångström, or It needs to be incredibly thin. And once the understanding has come, you will see what sounded like nothing is the biggest thing there is. No doubt, this is bigger than anything I come across. But it sounds like nothing in the beginning, for a good reason, because the confusion lies at a certain level in our thinking. If we compare thinking to a structure of a house, it is not at the very foundation, but it is somewhere here. And think that you are an architect or a builder. You need to get at that specific problem. If you're being unspecific, and you say that the problem lies